I call this spiritual impulse, what I call this creative impulse, as the authentic self. It's what I call in my teaching work, I call it the authentic self. The authentic self is the pure urge to evolve at the highest level. It's the urge towards consciousness. It's the urge to become more conscious. It's the mysterious compulsion. It's awakening to the mysterious compulsion towards consciousness. That urge to become more conscious, or the compulsion to become more conscious, that some people feel very strongly, other people feel it less strongly, is what I call the authentic self. And anybody who experiences the awakening of what I call this authentic self will realize upon a little bit of reflection that the urge to become more conscious, or the urge towards consciousness, the compulsion to become more evolved, is a different part of yourself than is your ego. The ego is an intersubjective phenomenon. The ego is not an individual matter. The ego is full of many fears and many desires, right? Everybody, can you recognize that your personally felt, separate, individuated self-sense, not the I was speaking about before, but the ego is made up of many fears and many desires. Some are very unique to the individual, but most are intersubjectively learned, and they come from our culture. Where do we get our values? Where do we get our values? From culture, right? Culture. We're all very conditioned. We are all very conditioned. Oh, I'm an individual. Yes, you're an individual, but you're very conditioned. We are very, very conditioned. That's not all bad news. It's actually good news. A lot of that conditioning is higher and higher perspectives that have a deeper and wider embrace. You understand? And some of it, of course, is not so healthy. But many of the fears and many of the desires that we have that really drive and influence many of the important choices that we make, that define the lives that we choose to live and the kind of individuals that we become, are not freely chosen and come from the individual and collective ego. You understand? Because we are all culturally created entities. None of us emerged fully formed out of a bubble. None of us did. You know, I mean, if you take a small human being and you put them in a closet or put them out in the woods, they're not going to develop beyond a very low level, right? We need culture to develop, right? So evolution at the level of consciousness happens through intersubjective friction. That's how the self evolves. The self does not evolve in isolation, right? It evolves through culture, through intersubjective engagement. So the values that many of us have are learned from culture. And the ego, which is not really an individual thing, its fears and its desires are largely conditioned culturally, and also to some degree having to do with our personal history and background. So the simple distinction I want to make is that when you experience what I'm calling the authentic self, or this mysterious urge towards consciousness, the ecstatic compulsion to become more conscious, the spiritual impulse, that's a very different part of yourself than is the ego, which has its own agenda. Now, the authentic self in you and the authentic self in me is only interested in creating the future. Remember, the urge towards consciousness, the urge to become more conscious, the ecstatic compulsion to evolve and to become more awake and more aware. So the urge towards consciousness is what I'm calling the authentic self, is a different part of yourself than is the ego. And that part of yourself and that part of myself, once again, is not self-conscious in the negative sense, is not afraid of life, is not ambivalent about being here on earth. There's not a trace of ambivalence. There's no hesitation. There is no doubt. There's also no existential confusion. So what I'm calling the authentic self, which is this pure, the spiritual impulse, which is experienced as this ecstatic compulsion, which is a different line, right? It's a different self line than is the ego. It's completely different. And it's the ego and what I'm calling the authentic self are parallel lines that never meet. There's one part of yourself and there's another part of yourself. So the impulse, because if you, for example, if you meet somebody and you meet them at a moment when they feel particularly awake to what I'm calling the authentic self, you'll notice a kind of intoxicating joy and a kind of confidence, a kind of fearless passion and conviction about life, about being here, and how important it is to do things right and to create a better future. Why? Because that's why we're here. That's why we're here. Because you see, from the perspective of the ego, well, you know, you don't even know why you're here, but there's a lot of things you need to do to take care of yourself, right? Because the ego's full of unresolved issues it needs to deal with, so many unfulfilled desires, so many needs. I need for me, right? So there's some variation on that. But the ego is full of self-needs, right? And it can get very self-righteous about them, too. Very important. It's called the sensitive self, right? Which like in my generation, which is the baby boomer generation, and our kids, the Gen X and Gen Y, the sensitive self has really become very highly developed. We're all full of ourselves and our own needs. But it's very interesting that what I'm calling the authentic self, when you awaken to it, when you become aware of it, is a completely different part of the self than the ego, and is inherently committed. It's not a choice that needs to be made. I need to make a choice to be committed to being alive. The authentic self in you, once you awaken to it, is already completely committed, right? So there's, like in other words, I mean, this is a rather gross metaphor for it, but I mean, I got to throw only thing that came to my mind. So. But for example, if you, for example, get sexually, excited, and you really are very compelled, sexually compelled, as you're compelled, and you are convinced, right? At least at that level, right? No, is that just me? I'm the only one. Maybe it's just me. So in the same way, the authentic self, when you awaken to it, that the passion and the conviction, the absolute conviction is inherent in the nature of the authentic self already. And when you see people, I've seen many people awaken to what I'm calling the authentic self. What they awaken to is this pure, doubtless passion and conviction about being here. You see. And it's very, very powerful. Because in the authentic self, there is no doubt about it. There's no why. Why did this happen? It's just, it is. That's all there is, right? And in the authentic self, which is eros, which is the creative principle, it's the creative principle. The authentic self is only interested in creating the future. The authentic self is not interested in being in the moment. A lot of, because some people talk about enlightenment, for example, about being in the moment. But the authentic self is not interested in being in the moment. It's only interested in creating the next moment and the next. It's the future. So the authentic self is it's a function in consciousness. It's not a person, but it's a function. It's an ecstatic compulsion to create the future.